Hello and welcome to another episode of IdeaXme. Today we'll be looking at economics and asking if the discipline could benefit from insights from other fields of study, such as quantum physics. One person who's thought a lot about this is David Roche, founder of the investment research firm Independent Strategy. David, I believe that early in your career you gained experience of an alternative, highly planned economic system. Is that right?
Oh, you mean was I a communist? Yes, I was a communist, and centrally planned economies was kind of what I did my thesis on, how they didn't work or worked at the time. And the interesting thing about planned economics is, of course, we don't have centrally planned economics anymore. We have centrally controlled economics, which is actually the same thing, which is really the best living example is one of the world's most successful economies is China, where you have total central control. In other words, this technology has come which would have prevented the collapse of the Soviet Union in many respects, not all respects, but in many respects, which is that instead of trying to put this year's or next year's planning for the consumer into a computer and then program a factory to make whatever you thought the consumer would need, which of course was usually wrong. We now have the technology to actually monitor the consumer as to what he really needs, what he thinks, what he looks like, is he good for the government or not, and should he be allowed to shop, travel, etc., etc. And we can actually produce everything he wants without building up massive inventories or the wrong capacity or all the nasty things that went on in centrally planned economics. So what I'm saying is, we have actually invented the technology which allows for what was an original economic theory, which is the total control of the state, to work what appears to be in a manner which pleases 1.4 billion people.
You spent some time in what would have been the USS, what was known as the USSR. I mean, how did it seem when you were there at the time?
Oh, look, it was grim and grey, and of course, you had people who changed their clothes but never changed their shoes, so you could always spot them after a time following you around. And there was nothing particularly, I mean, it wasn't kind of, in that sense, great. But I was there, during really the beginning of the end. I mean, it was a kind of Khrushchev-Andropov period. And the one thing I do remember about it was what great parties we had. Now, that is not a very ideologically right way of talking at that time, and it's probably hypocritical at this time. But it was the parties that went on in Moscow in those days were just unbridled affairs. Unbridled affairs. Of course, at that stage of your life, one was fairly unbridled oneself. So I remember those things, and I remember, doing things like planning the production of bras, in Gosplan, where there was only one make of bra, called a babushka bra, because that's the only pair sort of grandmother would fit. And of course, the production schedule coming out of the computer was actually running at the level which was required for 5 years ago. I can remember that very well. It was a terrific experience.
Are there any lessons from the way that bras were produced decades ago in the former USSR that can help us to understand economics better today?
It would help you to centrally plan an economy, because what you would not try to do is to say the average size of a lady in the Soviet Union is this size, and therefore we're going to produce an average bra, because it's going to fit no one. Okay, neither the smaller nor the bigger. It's going to fit a few people at the median, but it's going to fit no one. So that's completely the wrong way to do it. The thing to do is to put everybody under surveillance, monitor what the shops are selling, get the shops to report instantaneously what you're selling, how you pay, where you pay, and pay on your phone, and take photographs of you at the same time, and then relay that information back up the supply chain so that the right things are produced to keep the masses happy. Now, you laugh at me, but I'm being controversial in the sense that I think centrally planned economies started at the back end to the front end of the production chain, and that was really, to put it mildly, ass upwards.
Right.
Now you have the technology to do it the right way around. Would that have made a difference in the Soviet Union? Would it have produced a kind of state-controlled, grim, middle-class economy, which was not bad enough to collapse and not good enough to rival the whatever you want to rival? And the answer is, I don't know, but it's a question I would ask.
Conventional economics has been around for quite a long time. And if we look back at, say, the great global financial crisis of just over 10 years ago, how useful a tool was it at the time? I mean, because not that many people saw it coming, the crisis.
Useless. But there's a reason for that. The reason is, there are two reasons. I'll give the first one first. That if you take the average number of economists in any worthy institution, we won't name them all because they're not only public sector like the IMF or the World Bank, and I can go on, or the OECD, but also the private sector, such as the major banks that, you know, safeguard in inverted commas our money. If you take the average of all those economists and all they say, they will all come to the same view of the world at the same time of the year, every year, normally around December the 20th. And that view, the one thing you can surely bet is it's going to be wrong. Okay, so the first thing that's wrong with economics is consensus thinking. And as human beings are by definition, the mass, the normal distribution of humans are grouped around the mediocre, that's what you're going to get. Mediocre forecasting, that's number one. Number two is, our economics, we train people in the wrong way. If you're in Germany, if you want to even be a basic economist, it's 6 years. It's almost as long as becoming a doctor in the UK. That is ridiculous. Nobody needs to spend 6 years learning economics. I think probably 2 to 3 years is plenty. But what happens is you train these people in what is the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is that everything, including, you know, the flicker of your face now and your eyelids, can be programmed. It can be put in a model. So you produce all these models, which are extremely sophisticated, and the mathematical complexity of them are usually beyond the comprehension of anybody who hasn't been through the same sort of training. You do these things, and of course, they're completely useless because you can't put human beings into models and you can't put human behavior into models. And economics is merely the statistical expression of human behavior. That's the second reason. And the third reason is because we are trained to think in terms of big, stable objects, kitchen tables, cars, our spouses, whatever. But we forget that actually, and all of our perception of the universe is based around those objects, but actually those objects aren't made up of big, stable objects. They're extremely unstable and made up of subatomic particles, which behave in completely different ways. But we can only think in terms of the big stable objects, and we can only forecast in terms of the big stable objects. Now, I'll give you an example. If you take Euclidean geometry and you put it into Einstein's theory of relativity, let alone into the complexity of the sort of economic, the sort of physics, particle physics, which we are now dealing with, Euclidean geometry breaks down, doesn't apply. Isosceles triangles in space are not isosceles triangles. So our whole perception is wrong, and therefore our economic perceptions and forecasts are rubbish.
So what's the answer? Do we take learning from the world of the study of quantum mechanics and try and apply that to economics? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that's one of the possible ways, but what we have to learn really to do is to deal with discontinuities. You can deal with it through quantum economics or through quantum physics, quantum mechanics, which dictates that the way things will behave is essentially quite contradictory to how we perceive things, which is really started and conditioned by Newtonian mechanics. And now we know that things don't happen that way. So you can do it that way, but there are lots of other ways you can do it. You can do it through the economics of discontinuity, for example, which is another school of economic thought. But what you cannot do is say models, economics will tend towards equilibriums. Those equilibria will be actually determined by rationality, and the functions and expression of that rationality will require the perfect decimation of information, so perfectly shared information. And of course, what happens is that the price mechanism sets happily the demand and the supply. And once you achieve that level, nothing further needs to change. All you need to do in your own mind is to throw a radical technology change, like the internet, for example, at that, and you can see that that theory just does not work. And effectively, it can be driven by completely different things, such as technological change, such as irrationality, such as a lack of free will, such as the possible fact that the universe and everything in it is predetermined, which also comes out of quantum mechanical theory as a possibility.
So are you saying that we should stop trying to model the economy, or we should try and model it in a different way?
I think we should model it in a different way, but I don't think it is essentially driven. I mean, it is really driven by the sort of cul-de-sac which economics is driving itself into at the moment, which is increasingly sophisticated, increasingly complex mathematical modeling. I think that is leading to absolutely nowhere.
So where do the answers lie? Where do we look? Do we need to talk to poets or artists?
And historians, particularly, because so much of economics is cultural. As you know and I know, what produces a successful economy in Germany is quite different to what produces a successful economy in the UK, if you can produce a successful economy in the UK. And what works in Japan does not work in France. If you spend money in a government turns around and spends money in, let's say, Germany, the likelihood is it will get spent and will result in an increase in output. If you spend extra money in Italy, the likelihood is Swiss bank accounts will increase and the Italian economy will not. So culture matters, history matters, discontinuities matter. All of these things need to be built into how we view where the world is going.
Now, you've talked about some phenomena there that, well, some of them are quite deep-seated and don't change very fast, whereas others do change very fast, like the advent of the shock of the internet.
Well, yes, but you know, I think the business of trying to forecast what is really going to happen next year is really an exercise in extrapolation. It's a very short-term thing. We extrapolate that GDP having grown by 2% this year will grow by X% next year. That sort of thing. You draw a line on a page, and that's really what these models do. They all rely on some sort of historical data to tell you what's going to happen in the next future period. So I don't think what I'm talking about is within that time frame. Probably that sort of budgetary forecasting will continue until we discover a way of bringing a greater number of less determined, less simplistic equations into it. I'm talking about the longer term. If you're trying to forecast, for example, what happens to US living, the wealth of the US, the living standards of the US compared to China in 25 years or 10 years, then I think you start to, you really are going to get nowhere by extrapolating current trends. All you will find, as everybody has found, and as there's total consensus, that China will overtake the US, and the US being socially split and people being highly polarized, losing confidence in the political system, despite Joe Biden, you know, the US is on a declining course. Well, that may or may not be true, but what it sure is that you're not going to get the answer to that by simply extrapolating existing trends. That is just absolute rubbish.
So how should, let's take the position of China and the US in 20, 25 years' time. If the conventional way of looking at that is wrong, how would you approach it, and what conclusions have you reached so far?
Well, the conclusion I would reach is that the takeover by China of the world really depends on the ability of a country with this centrally controlled political system, which has no aspiration and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they have no aspiration to become democratic, can they actually drive growth at that rate and achieve economic preeminence with a system based on that? Or do you reach a level where that becomes intolerable to their own culture, and therefore they change either in a revolutionary manner or in an evolutionary manner? I would ask myself questions about that. I would say I would ask myself a lot of questions about the United States concerning the polarization of society, concerning the dysfunctional nature of politics, and also concerning the fact that wealth inequalities are growing and income inequalities are growing so fast, not only, of course, in the United States, but everywhere. And where does that actually lead us? I think these are factors which, if reflected on, and I'm not trying to say that I have the answers, because I'm not intelligent enough to actually translate something as disorderly as quantum mechanics or quantum physics into quantum economics, but I can tell you that one is much more likely to be linked to the other than it is to be linked to traditional economics. I don't know the answers to the questions I'm asking, but I know to ask the questions. And I know that if I was considering this, I would consider a far wider range of factors than what is being put into the melting pot of economic forecasting at the moment.
So this this discipline, if that's the right word, of quantum economics, we're still at the early stages of this, and we're trying to work out what factors to look at, or we're trying to work out how to look at these factors.
I think it's both. I mean, if you look at quantum physics today, there are numerous questions about the fact that you may have predeterminism in a total sense in the universe, not decided, but it certainly is a logical conclusion from certain scientific experiments. Whether we have parallel existences, whether there exists loop theory or string theory, all of which imply different things about the way that human beings can not only perceive what they're doing, what they're made up of, and what they can actually expect to happen as a result of the way that reality is constituted. Now, these are all areas of quantum mechanics which are in the experimental undetermined form, as is the theory of gravity in relation to what Einstein gave us. Quantum mechanics does not really have a theory of gravity. So all of these things are moving forward, but they're not moving forward in a science fiction type of way. What happens is that the quantum scientists have immense creativity, quite the equivalent of the creativity of a great writer or a novelist or a poet. And they, in their experiments, put up a hypothesis and then work on it, often for decades, until it is proven or proven. Now, for example, the fact that before it is measured, a subatomic particle, like, for instance, an electron, is actually in multiple places at the same time. So that you're sitting there, but you're also sitting where I'm sitting. This is a world which, of course, we can't actually reason about. We can't even reason or we can't even picture in our minds 4 dimensions, but 4 dimensions are essential to all of this work. All of these things are teaching us how to think about how we are and how we see things. So that side of the equation is moving forward. Then how do you incorporate this into actual forecasting, actual studies of how economics works? And the answer is you're really at the very, very beginning. You're really out of statements from people like me, which are that clearly what we are doing and how we see things in economic terms is wrong, because it is not how we are constituted. It is not how the universe is constituted. So that is wrong. But am I smart enough to say, okay, well, here's a new package, blue ribbon, pink wrapping, open it up. This is the new theory. And this is what is going to work. It's the new economics. No, I'm not smart enough for that. But, you know, the Maynard Keynes or the Milton Friedman of this type of thinking is out there. probably a great deal younger than me, probably not even born yet, but that is the way it is going.
Is conventional economics then in some way characterized by an overconfidence, a kind of, we do have all the answers?
I think it's not overconfidence, I think it's arrogance. Let me give you an example. If you think of a global economy as being a tapestry, or let's say a quilt, okay, you have four sides. Okay, now the four sides are, let's say, GDP, geopolitics, inflation, and policy. Okay, so you have four sides. And in between these four sides, you have lots of little magic squares, like Paul Clay's magic square. Okay, now when you get the economists who are traditionally trained, and let's say you're on December the 1st in a large bank, they all meet in a room, maybe 30 plus, maybe 20 plus, but anything over 2 plus will produce mediocrity in thought anyway. The reality is they think about this quilt, and they predict the four corners, and then they make it intelligently and with computers consistent in every one of the magic squares. So the magic square might be China tells the US to go and drown itself, and you really get a Cold War. Or it might be that the US dollar is going to go down because the US budget deficit is far too large and people will run away from the dollar. Or that China replaces the US dollar. They make all of this stuff consistent with the forecasts that they have produced, which are the four taut corners of our quilt. Now, traditional economics will present that to you and say, on December, whatever the day, and say, there you are, this is what's going to happen. And by the way, asset markets are going to go up. And would you like to fill your boots with this because we can make a lot of money out of it, blah, blah, blah. You know that that is the wrong way round, because how do you know that this is not the right way to think about things? You know it because you only have to go back to a crisis like the GFC, like COVID, effect on the economy. And you can see that actually what happens is that the magic squares, 1, 2, or 3 of them, get completely out of order in a way which is inconsistent with themselves and inconsistent with the total quilt. And they disrupt it and destroy it, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Now, that is how we are trained to think. That is how economists do it. And that is why it doesn't work, because the magic squares are not consistent any more than the particles which make us up, the quarks which make us up, are consistent. They are not. They actually operate with a logic which is their own and which is naturally both decoherent and disruptive. That is the key to quantum economics. Now, that's not an answer, but it is an explanation.
The world you've been describing, the world of conventional economics, is, well, that description sounds rather frightening, because this consensus, which appears to hold all over the world amongst institutions and banks and governments, the outcomes of this way of looking at things have real world consequences, don't they? I mean, the investment plans of trillions of dollars and the livelihoods of millions.
Well, you can say yes, indeed. Yes, it does. And it's normally, of course, the less skilled, less privileged, who suffer. It's been true in COVID. It was true in the great financial crisis. In effect, that has not changed. But it is not the responsibility of the economists to cause that crisis, though they might, proper regulation would have prevented excesses in banks and so on and so forth. The reality is that human behavior is disruptive. That is the key. And once you start forecasting from disruption and incoherence, then you get different results. And perhaps you can build better buffers, and you can build you can build a system which has less cost for the people who normally suffer from these crises. But what you cannot do is expect things to behave in a consistent, coherent, consensus manner, because they don't by nature.
Are you a lone voice? Or
No.
are there other people out there now?
Look, there are a lot of more intelligent people than I am. There's a whole school of thought about non-equilibrium economics. It has various names. They go at it in different ways. I will personally think the inspiration is to go back into looking at how we are constituted, what questions that poses about the universe. If, for example, there is no free will, then implementing a policy which you think is new and is going to cure all these things is rubbish, because actually that policy was predestined, and the things that disrupt will go on disrupting. So there are all sorts of consequences. That is why I related to quantum mechanics. But having said that, there are lots of schools of thought, including very, very extraordinary people who actually now realize that the old school of economics does not help us forecast and, in fact, take insurance against crises. They actually encourage it.
So what's your message then to someone embarking today on training as a conventional economist?
Read novels, read history, keep your mind alive, because unless you're very careful, the next 4-6 years, depending on which economy, which country you're going to be studying economics, will do a very good job of killing your mind. And if it succeeds, you will end up in a huge brokerage or a huge ministry with a lot of other people who have been similarly had their minds slaughtered, producing huge models which will be completely and utterly useless.
But if you don't do that, if you start reading history, start reading novels, what might that make possible?
In the best case scenario, what it will do is inspire young people who go back to the idea of a broader, general, might I say liberal arts type of education. They might actually be able to think through the specialization they're going through and actually change the nature of it. That is not my job. It's not my ability. I'm not smart enough. I'm not young enough. But that is what you have to say. I don't think that going in the narrow confines of the cul-de-sac of modern economics will lead to an improvement in the science. I think the widening of that road to include other forms of culture and that impact upon the way that the economics itself is researched and carried out, that will happen. It will happen. You cannot confine the human mind forever, because somebody will eventually come along and say, this is not working. I mean, even the Soviet hierarchy, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, which weeded out all the nonconformists on the way, it still produced Mikhail Gorbachev, who was so successful at actually destroying the whole damn thing.
If we switch to a world where we focus more on the possibility of disruption, won't we end up with something fantastically incoherent?
Yes.
A million different economic
Yes. That's perfectly correct. That's how it is. That's how life is. That's how the universe is. That's how we are. Now, of course, that will not lead to the destruction of everything, because if you consider the universe, it is pretty well amazing that, this chaos, this expansionary, accelerated chaos, does not actually bump into each other to the degree of destroying itself. It doesn't happen. Now, two theories. One is that all sorts of things like gravity play a role in stopping that happening. But the other theory is it's all predetermined. So chaos, if you go for the predetermination theory, which I think there's a great deal to support personally, though I do not pretend for 1 second that it is a proven fact coming out of quantum mechanics at the moment, but it is not far away. If that is the case, then that's how it should be, and how the disruption should be.
David Roche, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us on this episode of the IdeaXme show. Our mission is to move the human story forward by sharing knowledge of the future. You can find us across the internet on all the major audio podcasting networks at www.radioideame.com, YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe